Fantastic. Okay, thank you very much. And just before I start, I want to acknowledge the Yuggarapull and Dangan Balloon people, on whose land the project work that we carried out was taking place, and just pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. So I'm going to drill right down here to lowland subtropical rainforest, so probably right at the bottom of the list of that typology that Mark talked about. And there's some connections here with some of the stuff that Jeff was talking about as well. So hopefully you'll be able to see that as well. So just very quickly, I'm going to be talking about particularly the Lamington fire and its impact, particularly on lowland subtropical rainforest at a community, species and weed level, the response that we took, and then what our current restoration work is, some of the challenges, and then just a few acknowledgements at the end. So in terms of the 2019 bushfire season, particularly in SEQ, there are actually 10 major fire grounds, as you can see on the map there. In some ways, the Lamington fire, which is down bottom right, was actually one of the smaller fire grounds, but because of what it affected, had lasting implications for the management of that area. Suffice to say, though, that there were really large impacts at Barney at Main Range, so 70% of those parts were burnt. Lamington, as I said, was actually quite low. And one of the things that was really hampered post-fire recovery was some of the extreme wet weather events that we had after the wildfires in September, October 2019. This slide here is actually a summation of 3 slides that I've tried to condense into one, but to try to give you some sort of idea of what actually happened on those couple of days in September when the Lamington fire roared up the Illanbarra Valley and actually burnt down the Binnaburra Lodge. So I was actually, by circumstance, one of the last people to stay in the lodge. It was part of the Gondwana Rainforest Advisory Committee. That meeting that I was part of finished at 2 p.m. A couple of hours later, there were spot fires on the western side of Beechmont and on the road leading into Binnaburra. I guess probably the main message I'm trying to convey here is that this was an unprecedented fire event, particularly for Southeast Queensland at this time of year. So really high wind levels, practically no humidity and really high temperatures. Unfortunately, as we know, the lodge did burn down, but QPWS actually, in a major effort, saved the information centre and the barracks by actually staying and fighting the fire. And that's probably something for another story, another day. But I guess one of the other key things was it wasn't that fire that actually took out a lot of the rainforest in the base of the valley. The fire was reignited a couple of months later from fallen timber, and under, again, severe temperatures and conditions, actually burnt into the northern part of Illanbarra, where the fire went through the first time a couple of months earlier, and then took out many hectares of lowland subtropical rainforest. So lowland subtropical rainforest is a critically endangered vegetation community under the EPBC. As you know, it's got that elevational limit of 300 metres above sea level. In terms of the fire damage, that was mainly to the canopy. And of course, once you get canopy damage and tree fall, weeds come in. It also damaged soil seed banks within these areas. And remarkably, it actually got into gallery rainforest, which in my experience is probably one of the wetter types of lowland subtropical rainforests. But because of the drought leading up to this event and the defoliation, particularly amongst the palms, and they've defoliated again post-fire in that bottom photograph there. But prior to that, the fire actually went in and took out that sort of ground layer. So you can see scars on the base of all those bungalow palms. Now, most of those palms survived, but that certainly wasn't the case in other areas. Just to give you a bit of a picture of some of the species impacts, and I've dropped out the Richmond birdwing and the quoll slides from this presentation just in the interest of time. But we were interested in things like some of the dwarf crayfish, which are really endemic to a lot of the mountaintops and the McPherson Ranges. So one of those species, Euastacus jagara, is only found from the Cascade Circuit at Main Range National Park. And as I mentioned before, 70% of that park burnt down. The fire didn't quite make it into these areas, but we know from experience that these species have a very strong relationship to vegetation cover. And if that cover is lost, or it's lost through drought and lack of moisture, and fire can get in, then we'll probably lose these species as well. Fire sometimes yields interesting information as well. So in our work, particularly in our restoration work in Lamington, we came across a lot of resprouting Caronia vines. It's an unfortunate genus, but it is the host vine species for the endangered pink underwing moth. We conducted a survey and eventually we found evidence of the moth in Lamington for at least the first recorded time. So ironically, that was a positive outcome of the fire event. It's an amazing species that has led to a couple of recovery projects now, and subsequently we've found quite a large population within the actual park. So an ironic sort of positive outcome. Just on the plant side of things, which is my interest, lots of rare species were affected by the fire. One of them, this Westringia, managed to get its roots into rock faces, has come back, but you can see the type of environment that it was and the fire was exposed to in the cave circuit there in your bottom picture of the slide. So quite a severe event in terms of where that species was located, but it is coming back. And the other major impact, of course, was weeds. So in our work, we were really interested in what type of weed species were starting to come in and populate these damaged areas. What sort of groups or categories did they fall into, and were they going to have a long-term lasting impact on the regeneration that we're also starting to see? You can see some photos there of some of the species that we were dealing with. In terms of our initial response to the fire, so we did what most people did. We did a rapid ecological assessment first up, looking at extent, the land tenures affected, and particularly the natural and cultural heritage values that were impacted. Lots of work with QPWS, Threatened Species Unit, traditional owners, and some of the landholders that bordered this area. And then, of course, getting on ground and having a look at what was actually, what had happened and what was coming back. In terms of then how that started to characterize our restoration response, some key questions started to emerge in terms of some of the things that we were looking at here. So what rainforest and wet sclerophyll plants were actually coming back post-fire? What mechanisms were these plants using to come back? And what category did these species fall into? And I guess it took me back to some of the work that I'd done with Rob Koyman in the 90s and some of his work in actually assigning successional status to different species in the rainforest. And then how does fire intensity affect the capacity of these two, particularly rainforest and wet sclerophyll flora, to regenerate post-fire? And then does that, or all of these, actually colour the specific strategies that we need to consider when we restore these areas? We were really lucky in terms of the work that we're doing to have a bit of time to walk a lot of the fire grounds, particularly in Lamington. And what we were doing with rangers and contractors as we were going through was taking photographs of some of the species that were coming back. And then we actually turned this into a report and started to identify, you know, what species were sprouting, what were those just coming back from seed, were there some that were doing both, and what were those that were actually killed outright. I guess the elephant in the room here is fire intensity, and we've yet to overlay some of this work with the different fire intensities that were experienced, particularly in that part of Lamington. But suffice to say that in low and moderate fire intensities, we were still seeing a lot of different responses to fire, particularly in terms of rainforest species resprouting. So we actually ended up assessing 100 species. We found at the end of the day that 93% of these actually resprouted. Only 5 were coming back from seed, which I thought was an incredibly low percentage, and 2 were killed outright, and they were the 2 palms, bungalows, and the walking stick palm. What we then did was to look at what successional status was ascribed to those species that were coming back. So we were really keen to know, well, you know, were pioneers dominating the resprouters and the plants coming back from seed, or was it a much better spread across the successional stages, so early, late secondary, mature phase, as Rob described back in the late 90s. Again, there are some other elephants in the room here, so we didn't look at issues like cover. So in some cases, obviously, pioneers can dominate in terms of cover. versus the actual successional diversity that we're trying to assess on site. So what we found in terms of those plants that we could subscribe a successional status to, that 20% were pioneers, 20% were early secondary, 17% were late secondary, and really interestingly, 43% were mature phase species. And that gave us sort of some confidence that the actual successional diversity that we were seeing in those plants, particularly that were resprouting, was quite broad and diverse. So it wasn't just a group of pioneers dominating the recovery grounds. So as a lot of people already know and are already doing, the strategy that we chose was just try to facilitate natural regen as much as we could. And it was interesting that there was a strong synergy here with some of the work that the state was also trying to bring about in some of the affected national parks. So our current restoration work, just to cover in a nutshell, so started in April last year, very much a World Heritage focus, particularly in those 3 main national parks. A couple of 100 hectares of habitat restoration, using that strategy that we've just described. Also trying to manage pest fauna, particularly cattle, just through reinstating boundary fencing, just to try to get those animals out of the parks. There are challenges though in what we're doing. So Jeff has already talked about myrtle rust. So that sort of compounding effects of, a pathogen like that and fire. Safety was an issue for us. There were actually 3 periods of tree fall sort of with these fires. An initial one when the fire went through, a second period of tree fall when damaged roots finally succumbed to root burning fires and trees fell over. And then a third period of tree fall once the rain came and then eroded root systems again. Access can be difficult, particularly with wet weather. The slide at the bottom there shows what a fire ground can look like when you get massive native regrowth from a native vine. So being able to manage native regrowth as well and to allow a greater diversity of species coming through, getting access to contractors. And then I guess at the end of the day, it is all about funding. We're lucky to get some millions of dollars for our work in Lamington Main Range and Mount Barney, but that did compare with the $35 million that was invested in restoring the road to Binnaburra, just by comparison. And just a few acknowledgements there of the people that were involved in this presentation. Thank you.